okay, that's it. Sony really needs to be stopped right now, especially with all these acquisitions swirling around what's happening with the company right now. You hear what's happening with Kadokawa in Japan, where there is a purchase looming onward for the manga and game publisher Fromsoftware, producing some of our best games when it comes to Bloodborne and other properties like Elden Ring. But we have other rumors swirling around Ubisoft, which is something I don't necessarily believe, but it is something that we've been seeing happening across all through the video gaming industry. There's been a spending spree across the gaming industry because a lot of companies see some weaknesses in these smaller studios. And we saw this with Microsoft purchasing Activision Blizzard and a multitude of other studios that have been consumed by that gigantic conglomerate. And we see what happens when you get consumed by these giant corporations. The product suffers. And I think that's what people are expecting to see here with Ubisoft and Sony. And I think that's what we expect with Kadokawa as well. That's why people don't want to see Fromsoftware be purchased by Sony, because we know we're going to see a dilution in the overall quality of the game itself. And I think that's the sad part about mergers that happen in the gaming industry. It usually leads to the deconstruction of a lot of the properties that we love. And I think that's what I see with Ubisoft. But of course, Ubisoft is already a failed company in and of itself. You just see about some of the properties they released this past year. You see what happened with Ubisoft. We see what's happening with Skull and Bones, Star Wars Outlaws. Ubisoft is in a tight position where it can't afford another failure, and it already has another failure rolling up this February with Assassin's Creed Shadows. So they're in a tight spot. They're probably leaning towards the end of bankruptcy. That's why we had rumors about them being purchased by some other company. Even Elon Musk was mentioned before. But that is the situation with the gaming industry nowadays, where we have a lot of studios producing terrible content and we have a lot of people looking to buy these terrible studios. And it doesn't seem like a winning formula, but when you want all the IPs in the world under your company, this is the best time to purchase. And I think that's what we're seeing with Sony right now. They're looking to purchase and snatch up devaluing companies that are destroying themselves through their policies and progressive politics and put them under their banner, which is weird because they have the same progressive politics that are destroying their company as well. You can just see this with all the games that have come out from Sony this past few years. They don't have the winning formula either. So I don't think that's going to be the case. I don't think there's going to be any positivity of Sony purchasing Ubisoft. And I don't believe the rumor 100%, but if you just look at Sony's track record at their previous purchases, you see what happened with Concord and the buying of Firewalk Studios. That company's ultimately leading to mass layoffs and produced one of the worst expenses for Sony, a $400 million failure in Concord. And I think that's the situation we see all throughout the gaming industry. We see these 400, 200 to $100 million failures, and you subsequently see these games going offline and closing and shutting down. So how would associating with Sony help Ubisoft when Ubisoft is already on the verge of bankruptcy and they're going to hook up with another company that shares the same values and may guide them into the same direction? I think this is only a liability for Sony. That's why I really don't believe this speculation that there's going to be a purchase, but it brings up the imagination about all these purchases that we have been seeing in the past few years in the gaming industry. None of them have been successful. And I think that's the key thing we have to realize when we hear about these purchases. It usually leads to the destruction of the smaller company, and it really lends itself to being a liability for the larger company. I think that's what we saw with Sony purchasing Bungie, and I think that's what we saw with Xbox and Microsoft purchasing every single studio out there, Activision, Blizzard, everything else that we've seen so far. It hasn't led to any positive outcome for those games. Maybe except Black Ops is still in the same position it's always been. But I think any other acquisition that we did see was an unmitigated failure. And that's what I expect to see to happen to any purchase that Sony actually makes. It's not going to be a positive outcome because they still have the same values and prospects of what they want to do in the gaming industry. And it doesn't look positive at all. I don't think they're going to make a change with their strategy of focusing on political progressive politics to be at the center of everything they produce content-wise. I think we even saw Sony try to buy Shift Up, the creator of Stellar Blade, and Shift Up straight up refused them because they didn't want to be in that ecosystem of censorship and political politics being at the forefront of their games. And I think that's a smart move, and I don't think Sony is going to pivot away from that way. We see all they do with Sony America and the producers there any games that have a direct influence over, we see a bad outcome. I think that's the situation we hear whenever we discuss about purchase from Sony. And Sony has been trying to buy almost every studio out there. We've heard they tried to buy CD Projekt Red. They said no. But CD Projekt Red has their own problems. Like I mentioned before, they're enamored with this progressive philosophy that they're putting into their games, and I don't think it's going to have a positive outcome. They're stuck up on what the consultants at Sweet Baby Inc. say. They're stuck up on these ESG policies that have been mandated by their investment banks like BlackRock and Vanguard. They think these are the positive things they need to do to produce content for gamers, and that is just not the case. But of course, people are going to argue that Sony's not in the gaming business, they're in the hardware business. They're just trying to sell PlayStations, but you're not going to sell a PlayStation if you have a bunch of terrible games. And I think that's the thing that we're learning nowadays about the video game market. You still need quality games to sell your hardware, and I don't think Sony's actually doing that with a lot of the properties they do have out there. I see them devaluing those properties in any way they can in their subsequent sequels. I think we saw that with Spider-Man 2. I think we saw that with Ghost of Tsushima happening. People are expecting that to happen. We saw this with Horizon Zero Dawn, with Horizon Forbidden West. We see a devaluing of all the properties they have direct control of. So I don't have any hope that Sony would actually purchase a studio and actually upgrade it. I don't think they can upgrade the Assassin's Creed games. I think they're going to just make them what they are now, terrible games that are focused on progressive ideologies and focused on these instances of gender and racial politics. I don't think that's the thing people want to see, and I think that's the only thing they know how to do now, unfortunately. But that's just my thoughts on the situation. Maybe you disagree with me. Maybe you think Sony can actually purchase these studios and make something positive out of it. I highly doubt it. They tried to buy so much studios in the past year. Square Enix said no. We saw what happened with Take-Two saying you just can't even afford us. They're looking everywhere to purchase a studio, and it seems they feel this is an arms race for IPs, and I think it is to a certain extent, but it's terrible for the gaming industry where everyone's trying to load up on IPs without a concern of making actual quality of their own products that they have right now. Because whenever I see a new Sony sequel, I know it's going to be trash, because we know the intent changes once there's success. People come in and say, hey, we have to inject these standards and practices of our ideology unless you don't want funding. And I think that's the core of Sony and the Western games development sphere. It's about injecting your modern day political ideology into the content regardless of the quality of the game. And unfortunately, that's not going to stop anytime soon. But you leave a comment, tell what you think. Do you think Ubisoft might be purchased by Sony? It isn't a desperate situation. It's probably the only company I see out there be ready to be purchased, because it's outright failing, and it's going to fail even harder in the future. So maybe everyone's just waiting for Assassin's Creed Shadows to come out to make their purchase, and I think that's a possibility, because that's a bomb in and of itself. But you leave a comment, tell what you think. I like to hear what you have to say. Sony purchasing studios in general, it must be stopped. I don't want to see it happen, but maybe you're a fanboy, you want to see this happen. I know there's still people living in the Xbox Sony versus world where there has to be a war between consoles, but now it's just a war between the corporations, and the fans are losing right now. But we have a few wins too. We haven't bought Dragon Age, Veilguard, and all these other games, so maybe they'll start listening to us. But you leave a comment, tell me what you think. Like, comment, share, subscribe. This is Wagner Knows Why. Catch you next time.